stories. Thank you very much.
Child, and about 10 years ago, I spent my birthday here, mainly traveling and seeing the temples and coming to see him. And yeah, so that was when I last came to Bhubaneswar.
So this session is not about Bhubaneswar, it's about another city, and one which you say you've got this complex, happy, sad, fraught relationship with, and that forms the bedrock of this extremely interesting and, again, I'm repeating the word, complex book about the way you see India today. So you said you went to Banaras first as a teenager. So what is this pull and push that you have with what we call the eternal city of India?
Well, it was very strange because I'd grown up in a certain way in India. I'd grown up fairly westernized and had very little access to a side of India that my mother described very loosely as secret India. And it was not something that my upbringing directed me towards at all. I was like directed towards American films and sort of completely westernized in every sort of way. And just before I was going to college in America, my mother suddenly had this sort of almost a kind of panic. And she said, you know, I wanted to go backpacking around Europe or something. And she said, no, you'll go to Banaras and you'll try to figure. And it was, I had no idea what I would do with that city. And so I went. I kind of like played almost, I felt like I was like a kind of hippie traveling in India, not like completely cut away from it. But the memory of that place and the fact that she'd wanted me to go there stayed with me. And as the years went by, it kind of grew in power. And I would go back to Banaras and I would try to look at it again, try to understand what I'd been asked to see. And the book begins with this moment where I arrive and I'm looking for a man called Tripathi, and we arrive in the Abhinavagupta library or whatever, and these grand Brahmins come in, and they're discussing Sphota, which is an esoteric Indian science about the relationship with sound and meaning. And I just finished university, and I was so struck by the fact that something that would have seemed almost...
It was a conversation in Sanskrit.
In Sanskrit. They introduced it in Hindi, and suddenly these people, they were not having a religious discussion, they were having a discussion about ancient linguistics in Sanskrit, and it had been down the road from me. And I thought it was so strange that this whole milieu should have been closed in the way that it had been. And so that was the beginning of my starting to learn Sanskrit. And I came back to Banaras after 6 years of studying Sanskrit because I felt that to not have that would be like to have too closed a world. And so it's a book about this city that even when you're there, they describe the power of Kal Bhairav is that the city can appear closed and hostile, but it can also begin to open layer by layer. And that's what happens in this book. This world that begins to, as Satsad is hostile, becomes more and more familiar. And I hope...
And you do run away once.
Well...
Your friend told you there's a tamas side to the city,
tamas,
which will, yes.
Yeah, beautiful word, by the way. It's related to words like temer, where we get the English tenebrous. It's a very old root for a darkness, and they talk about this tamasic character of Banaras, and so at the beginning of the book there's a wonderful man who's now dead called Martan Singh, who was one of the founders of Intac, and he was the only real key that we and people like us in Delhi who'd been deracinated, who'd kind of had English education, he was one of the few connections to this other world. And he was the first person I went to see because I wouldn't have even known how to begin to go to Banaras. I wouldn't have known who to be in touch with. I would have known nothing. And he said to me, you know, you're a very intense young man and you have this, and you mustn't let Sanskrit consume you in this way, which of course it did. And he said, and this city, you have to be able to look at that river and say, I hate you. And when it's time to flee, you must flee. And it's very special advice to Banaras because because it's not an easy city. There's a restlessness, there's a darkness, and everyone acknowledges it. You know, it's part of what makes Benares. It can be terrifying.
So you know what else is not easy is your book, because it is a complex book with many ideas which you know, people like us tend to not address. You use the word deracination, which is a strong word.
Yeah.
I would prefer a milder alienation. So we are alienated from our own culture, and Martin Singh, I also lead another life where I work with textile. He's this iconic figure who worked intensively and extensively with the weavers across India, and that was just one of the ways he reconnected to the culture. As Aatish is concerned, that we occasionally just keep looking to the West for everything.
But I'll interrupt you just to say that I'm not talking about some pious, one must revere one's culture, one must...
Not at all.
I'm talking about the fact that these things are interesting, and the fact that we should grow up with a kind of systematic incuriosity for our own things. I have a niece, for instance, who's passionate about the ancient world in Greece and Rome, and it's that passion has seeped down to her from the West, and she's perfectly able to look at those things with a sense of wonder. That we don't have that sense of wonder is part of our historical making. It's part of what happened to us. And so overcoming it for me is not an exercise in piety, but an intellectual exercise.
Yeah, it's an intellectual exercise, but the fact of the matter is it's a rare exercise for my class, or our... I'm using a dangerous word, class, here. We tend to think that we achieve...
We're going to use an even more dangerous word in a few minutes.
In a few minutes, yes. So we tend to run away from a few unsavory aspects of our past, and then we run away from it all. Or if we dwell in the past, like when you go to the village and you feel that nothing has changed in centuries. So
well, this is very interesting what you're saying now, because I feel you're discussing this idea of a break with the past.
Yes.
Now, I was in Egypt just now, and there you have the past of Egypt dwarfs the past of Greece and Rome. I mean, they don't even show you the Roman buildings because they're a mere 20 centuries old, and if they're not like 2000 BC, the Egyptians are not interested. But at the same time, one is acutely aware in Egypt that the coming of Islam has brought a clear line.
Yes.
And in the case of the Egyptians, there is not a feeling of continuity, which in India is undeniable. So I was, in fact, talking about this yesterday. You have these different layers where, for people like you and me, the coming of the British and our acculturation in European and modern culture has constituted a break. We are, in some ways, have been remade by this history. You meet people now.
So I'll just interrupt. So
Yeah.
if you can talk us through the whole concept of one whole chapter is called that, rape and seduction.
Right.
So this amazing term, which I think Aatish should talk about in relation to this.
It's to describe basically the fact that it's Arthur Koestler's phrase, and he talks about the idea that we may have ruled by rape, the Europeans, but we influenced by seduction. And what he's basically talking about is this idea of both the appeal and the affront of the Western presence in Europe, and that when colonization was over, when the physical edifice of empire had been lifted, we who'd been influenced by it.
Can you hear? I think your mic. Can you hear
Can you
him?
hear?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think you can.
We who'd been influenced by it were left with the fact that the West was still going to exert an appeal in our life. We were not going to. We may have turned away. In fact, once some of the more harmful aspects of Europe had been removed, its appeal exerted itself on India for the next 50 to 70 years. And as I say in this book, the real colonization began after independence. You know, that was
And
when...
people did worry about it, like you mentioned Kumaraswamy and others of that.
They saw it
Bonan.
coming. They saw that nothing had been done to address the question of cultural freedom we talked about, it comes up in this book as well, people are talking about political freedom, they're talking about economic freedom, and there's some people who are very concerned about the idea of cultural freedom, that what would India do to reckon with the fact that it had had this relationship with its culture, and what would it do to change that? As it turned out, it did nothing, and it let the old structures remain. And the process has continued working away at us, and it's, so yeah, that was the idea of this reckoning with both the rape and the seduction, that those two elements of.
Yeah. So talking about continuity, is continuity the problem, that we didn't have a break and a reboot?
I mean, it's very hard, because on the one hand, it's very beautiful to see there are moments in the book where you meet people who literally live as people did 25 centuries ago, and the world of tradition is intact in them. And when you see it, from my perspective, it does have a seductive quality. And at the same time, I feel that this relationship, that when a break occurs, it can be a very fertile, very creative thing, that people who have lost the past, who are bereft of it, when they make a journey back, wonderful things can happen. You know, the Renaissance in Europe was the understanding that the old Greek and Roman world had died. It took 10 centuries for Europe to become aware that the continuity of Greece and Rome was over. And once they could see that the past was dead, they were able to renew themselves. And that power, that potential exists in India, in my mind, very much so.
So, how does your tryst with Sanskrit tie with this desire to have this Indian Renaissance? Do you see them linked? Do you see the language of Sanskrit and its problems as a microcosm of a larger problem?
I mean,
where Sanskrit is taken over by the religion, and what you saw as a postgraduate student rarely happens today.
Yeah, but this is not, I mean, every ancient language has a liturgical function. Greek, Latin, they all have, the Avestan language, they all have a liturgical function. What Sanskrit also has is a very clear understanding at the time that one thing constituted scripture, another thing constituted shastra, and there was this world of kavya, which is pure literature. It's pure, no one should have any problem approaching all of those things as if they were part of our literary inheritance. And for me, the reason to go back to Sanskrit was a very simple desire to hear a literary voice from the past. It's the kind of thing that a normal European can do without even thinking. He can go back 500 years, he can go back sometimes 800 years, he can, with a little effort, go back 2,000 years. But for someone as myself, beginning as a writer in India, I couldn't go back at all. I couldn't go back. I mean, the first journey back was just to Manto, who was just the other day, you know? And then obviously when it came to Sanskrit, it unlocked something so much bigger, because you had this world of the commentators, which formed a kind of history of reading that ran parallel to the production of literature. So not only did you have literature, but you had people who for 1,000 years after that literature had thought about it, had written it. And I remember one of my earliest teachers telling me, they said, if we can get you to the point where Malinatha can teach you the Kumara Sambhavam, then that would be the ultimate goal. And that was possible.
So did you reach that ultimate goal?
Yeah, I could definitely.
Have you read Panini's Ashtadhyaya?
No. I certainly, Panini is very, very difficult. And but someone like Malinatha, working in 14th century, in this region of the world actually, I mean in Andhra, but in that, and he is one of those incredible commentators who you can really depend on to be very clear, breaking up compounds, simplifying the syntax, and by the end of the paragraph, you've understood the verse of Kalidasa, which was written 1,000 years before, and I feel like, I thought it was a scandal that I should have grown up in India, and that the intellectual excitement of that should not have been part of my schooling. I mean, something had gone wrong for people to not see that that was something fascinating and wonderful.
So this has been a journey. You went back twice, thrice. So the problems are very well documented in this book.
Right.
Are there any solutions?
You know,
Because there's something called frozen by foreign rule, which Naipaul said in his, I think it was in the Million Mutinies, that India in many ways, the culture was frozen by foreign rule and poverty remained, and a lot of urban Indians associate, even, for instance, let's talk about the sari. It's something many Indians of our generation don't wear it because subliminally it's connected to a past and to a regressive time, and the Western wear has become a symbol of progress.
Right.
And everyone should wear what they want,
Right.
but this narrative which takes a woman from wearing a sari to deciding to wear a gown
yeah. Well,
is a similar narrative in a very unintellectual way.
and I cannot emphasize enough, one does not want to have to fight a crusade on behalf of one's culture.
Yes,
like
of
life
course
is
not.
hard enough. Well, you know, what I'm talking about is something I feel like the only answer, and this is where I part
Yeah, so
ways.
what is the solution? That's what I was asking.
I think that the answer is, if you reawaken the life of the mind in India, which is something that can happen on the level of a book, it can happen in the classroom, it can happen. If you are able to do that, for me, like, the real route back for the wonder of the past is through the mind, and this is where I part ways with people on the right and what they hope to do with Sanskrit, because they're doing it again. When you make a language a symbol, or when you make it when you sort of burden it with the idea of national pride, you turn something that's wonderful into like eating spinach, you know, and nobody wants to have to do that. So for me, I really think that it's intellectual curiosity that, and I let me say that it is happening. There, even in the
Where is it happening?
I think that there are books emerging in India to do with an interest in the past, studies that are emerging, that there is something stirring in the Indian consciousness, which, if it is given the proper outlet, there is no reason why it won't result in something. Obviously, the dangers are that moment of confrontation with history, which again you quoted Naipaul. You know, he has that wonderful phrase in Million Mutinies now. To awaken to history was to cease to live instinctively, and it was to see oneself as others saw one. And then he says, and it was to know a kind of rage, because the realization of what has happened to you historically is not an easy, peaceful thing. It's something that has the potential, as much as it has a creative potential, it has a tremendous violent potential. And I feel like on many levels at the moment right now, history is awake in India. I mean, we're confronted by the fact that even if you look at something, and this is part of its misuse, but if you look at the political sphere, people are dealing in history and historical symbols in India with a passion and a kind of fury that is, you don't see that in Europe and America. You don't see people dealing with the 500-year-old past and getting like walked into a frenzy about it as one does here. So there is a certain kind of energy, and I think one has to wait to see how it will be directed.
Okay. The other thing about this novel, and its early reviews have started to come, is that it's annoyed people on every side of the argument, which is a good thing, and it has also pleased people on every side of the argument. It's also pleased people
from Karan Thapar to Ram Madhav. I mean,
Yes.
that's a pretty big spectrum.
Indeed, it is. So one of the reasons I reckon is that you have been non-judgmental about intellectual integrity. So there's a character called Mukhobadhyay, we discussed him last evening, who strongly believes, and now we're coming to the second difficult word of the evening. He strongly believes in the importance and the value and the relevance of the caste system, and he's intellectually very sharp, very sound, but he is also unshakable in his belief that this is the only way the past of India can be kept intact. He's not saying this from a political point of view either. He's just talking about it as something that needs to be kept alive. He's willing to cook for he can't eat from the hands of a lower caste student. So he cooks for the student and ensures the student then goes and washes up elsewhere. So he's a good man, but he is caught in this thing, that in this caste system that, again, people like us find completely, I mean, you're aghast. Your shock is palpable in the book when you can talk us through the situation about the love.
The very important thing that you have to know about Mukhopadhyay is what he says about himself, which is that I haven't merely accepted all of these beliefs. They haven't simply been passed down to me, but I have rethought all of this. So I have looked again in my tradition and infused it with thought, and I have come to the conclusion that I still believe in the prohibitions around food. And so when it starts off with a kind of abstraction of him describing his caste, he wants to immediately, almost as if to shock me, to I'm a very strict man, and you know, somebody jokes with me if I come and sit down opposite you while you're eating, what would you do, Professor Mukhopadhyay? He says it will not be tolerated. You know, so he's trying to like shock me in this way, and in the beginning I'm sort of having him speak in freely, but when I travel into the country and I encounter for the first time that moment where you see the food prohibition at work. We're in this house, in this village house, and it's a totally Brahmin village, and our driver is a Yadav man. He, for some particular reason, I am exempt the caste rules, but he's not exempt the caste rules. And these people make...
Why do you think that is?
You know, I think that they think that the way that they used to say that the Gandhis are beyond caste, or they used to say that, you know, the Hindi movie industry, they don't notice. I think that something happens to you when you enter the world of English so profoundly that to them you become a Sab, or you become some kind of foreign entity where you're not subject to the rules of caste. So there were no questions asked, even though they were probably, had I said, if I have a Muslim father or something like that, it would have been, it was a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy, but they just didn't feel, I think, that I was subject to these rules. But they made this extraordinary exception, and they had the driver eat with them in their house off their utensils. But as dinner was coming to an end, they said, you know, there's something we absolutely cannot do. And it kind of like descended on us, this sort of chill moment. And they said he has to be told, only him, that he must go outside and wash for himself. And it was such a small thing, but it was infused with, it had a kind of implication that was, and I remember just the sight of this man being told, and he crumbled, and he said, you know, you're like gods to us, and he went out and was washing his things, and
that made it worse, that he didn't complain, protest.
No, as Baldwin says, you know, that people are part of the same laws that apply to the people on top, apply to the people below, and there's a social compact. You know, it's an understanding, and so it was not shocking for him in the least bit. And when I came back to Mukhopadhyay and I asked this narrow question, tell me about the food prohibition, he got like a little bit, he had his back up, and then he says to me, he says, you know, you people in the West, you have this idea that all men are created equal, and that they go on to become differentiated. And he said, we have a different idea. We have this idea that you're born cobbler, sage, Brahmin, you're born unequal, but that you're headed to a kind of destiny where all men are equal. Even though to believe that, you would have to believe in the transcendence of the soul, and in the fact that you would live many lifetimes before this fate. And it was an idea that nobody could be asked to accept today. You know, but he this was.
And he is aware of that.
I think he was aware that he was encircled, and that this belief of his was not something that could survive a new time. It was again coming back to the idea. It was such a fundamentally unappealing, ugly idea, and he, as much as he wanted to defend it, it was indefensible, and I think he felt the pain of that, even though, because he said to me as we were leaving, he said, you know, my arguments may not be perfect, but let me tell you, I never speak falsely, and I completely believe that, but that is part of the weakness of the world of tradition. That's why one can't romanticize it, you know.
So there are other very interesting characters who Aatish comes across and speaks about right through the book, and Marthand is someone you could tell us about and how he predicted what he did, as well as Kumaraswamy. You know, people we tend to forget actually who had signal contributions to the way art history and a lot of what we know of our past is written. And so you can talk us through the influence of those people on this book, because you quote them very often through the book.
Kumaraswamy is wonderful. I mean, the first Kumaraswamy is one of those characters who actually came to me through Naipaul, through my relationship with Naipaul. I was in the Delhi Museum, and we'd gone to see the bronzes, and it was a very nice thing, because there again were these beautiful artifacts that had become famous throughout the world, and yet it was not something that I, who loved art and went to museums all the time, I would never have gone to see the bronzes. It would take someone like Naipaul to say, you know, and to help me kind of. There's a line in Kumaraswamy which says, he says that, you know, to enter the spirit of an unfamiliar art requires an energy that, or makes demands on you that most are unwilling to make. And, you know, I hadn't been, the idea of looking at something like a Chola bronze and looking at it as an object of beauty, again, it had not been part of my upbringing. And so Naipaul started to kind of open up these things for me. And in the course of it, he told me about Kumaraswamy, who was Sri Lankan. He was a burgher of half European, half Sri Lankan descent. And he says, you know, it was open to him to be a kind of Mayfair gentleman with a life in the country. And instead he decided to devote himself to the precise meaning of Indian ritual and art, and became one of the... And there's a funny story related to Banaras, because at the age of 40, about 1916, Kumaraswamy had collected a vast collection of Indian art. And he approached the Banaras Hindu University, which was about to open, with the proposition that he would give them his entire work of art if they would have a chair for Indian art at the Banaras Hindu University and make him the professor. And Naipaul gave one of those dangerous laughs. And they said they told him to go away. They told him to take his art and go away. And the art is sitting in Boston, you know, and the BHU was trying to bridge the gap that had appeared, and still something in our mentality had appeared, and a kind of opportunity had been lost.
And a bit about, I'll ask about Naipaul as well, because there is a sense of, you know, the book somehow reminds one of Naipaul, not just the style, but perhaps having he's written about similar themes, though from different perspectives. But before that, a bit about Marthand.
So yeah, as I said to you earlier, Mapu was from the Kapurthala family. I describe him in this book that he was part of a generation of Indians, or his parents were part of a generation of Indians who were culturally bilingual. You know, there was Auntie Sita, who was his mother, was a celebrated beauty of Europe, completely at home. I think, you know, dressed by Mambochet, photographed by Man Ray. All the people, all the sort of grand people of Europe were her best friends. And yet she was completely culturally rooted and was able to move in a way that people of Mapu's generation, which is my mother's generation, felt they could no longer do. You know, that they were aware that something had been lost, but those channels were closed. And Mapu was one of the few people I know who made a journey back, what Fanon calls like a return to self. And I didn't realize it at the time, but we were very aware in that little isolated world of anglicized Delhi that Mapu was a little different, you know, and people would joke about Ahmedabad. They'd say, oh, he was so glamorous, my dear, but then he went to Ahmedabad and it was the ruin of him, you know. And of course it was rubbish. He like redesigned the Calico Museum. It was his making. But you know, we were, as to use Naipaul's phrase, we were really people who gloried in our ignorance, you know. And so Mapu became somebody. The book is dedicated to him, and it's dedicated to him because he was the first person or the only person that was available to me to make a beginning, you know, and also to frame that problem, to
quest.
Because you know what happens to the colonial, you know, when you go into that world, people are very in that. It's that the intellectualism, the anti-intellectualism is not pronounced. It expresses itself as a form of complacency. People are lazy and ignorant. They say things like, oh dude, I've never read a fucking book in my life, you know? And you think like, that's a horrifying, you know, it's a celebration of ignorance, but it's inadvertent. And so to even understand what you are, you need someone else. And Mapu was because of this thing that he'd done, he kind of stood out as someone who'd seen this world for what it was, and so he was very important to me in that respect.
And you know, you've spoken about how you've spent time with Naipaul. We lost him this year, and I'm not saying this particular book is in any way, but have you had conversations on the subjects that you've touched upon here with him? Because he was this great commentator on many of the problems that did, you know, India.
I will say in a funny way that one of the last conversations I had with him, and he was not 100% there by that point, and I said to him, I said, you know, I want to do a book about Brahmins. I want to use the Brahmins as a lens to sort of look at. I don't even know if I knew that much. I think I may have just said I wanted to write about Brahmins, and Nadira interrupted and she said, what are you going to write about Brahmins? You know, go write. And his like face brightened. And he said, no, that would be wonderful. And so it was a kind of odd, like, little moment that I had with him just before. And no, I was never really able to speak to him because by that point, I was away and living apart, and so I really didn't see him to discuss the book, but I felt like I had.
But you did run by the first,
yeah.
Yes, you did tell him that you were going to do this.
Yeah, he understood immediately what might happen.
So this was one side of the book, these wonderful people, not Naipaul, but the rest do make some very significant entries into the story and the narrative. But equally interesting are the Ganga Kinare Wala Choras who keep coming in and going. There's Anand, there's the boy who takes you to his Shivam, who you said you still are in touch with. So they are the other side of the twice born story, because they're confronted with a world where their relevance is receding, and yet they are the inheritance of this legacy of being twice born.
Well, also more importantly, you know, and that's why the book matters, in my opinion, is that the thing that had happened to us, if it had happened only to us, and it was simply a matter of shrugging off the rule of a kind of deracinated colonial class, and India could get on with its business, then it would not be very important at all. It would simply require us either kind of like being sort of shrugged off or something worse. But it would what Anand and Shivam represent is that the process that had occurred in my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation was now beginning to assert itself in their generation. And they were experience what the anxieties that I had come to Benares with were anxieties they understood. And that was what was important, because as this business rolls out and the world of tradition collapses, it releases a tremendous energy. And one of the things that that energy can feed, if it's not the energy of Renaissance, is that it can feed a politics of revival and a politics of revenge. And these boys had become part of the ABVP in a quest to regain the past in clumsy ways. To not lose what was of value, but at the same time, they didn't know how to make what they valued valuable in this new world. They could understand its power, they felt acted upon, they felt that they were not the people who had come before them, that generation by generation. So for me, their importance was that they were a mirror to my concerns. And yeah, that's...
And finally, you keep coming to India. You now live. You've set up home in New York. So does India worry you, or do you see that, as you said, the intellectual life does occasionally, that there is some reignition of it, or are you by and large worried?
No, India's. The reason why one is worried is one hasn't cracked the problem, and one has been trying for 100 years, if not more, to crack a cultural problem that will, once it is in some ways, if it's something that one can move forward from, then India won't feel as mired as it does at the moment. We feel like we talk of it politically, but politics is never separate from these deeper cultural. And this book is not a political book. It's a book that's concerned with this cultural problem. And right now, to be at the impasse that we're at politically, to feel that 5 years ago a major event happened in the political life of the country, and it was filled with hope and expectation, and that it's come to nothing, and yet there is not a range of options. There's not a feeling that one could move forward in different ways. Like that stasis is worrying. Because in a moment as delicate as the one we have right now in India, which is the moment of just like a tremendous transference of people in a state where their direction hasn't been fixed, that potential, and of course in my mind I'm thinking always of Pakistan, where the potential violence of a moment of expectation going wrong has been realized. And so when a country is at a precipice like that, you can never stop worrying. You can never, enough people haven't been brought over to the other side for us to sit back and, and think things will be okay.
So you are mostly worried.
I'm watching.
You're watching. Okay.
A little worried.
So now I think it's a good time to take a couple of questions from the audience.
Oh, really?
Yes. And if you could keep it short, because we are running terribly late. Yes.
So for us, a new discovery you made, you said colonization started in India after independence. However, I would like to know how you justify your title, The Twice Born, how the idea came to your mind.
So the thank you for the question. The Twice Born refers obviously firstly to the idea of being Dvija. So the Brahmin is born in his biological body, his biological birth, and then again when he's initiated into his caste. So there's that one idea of the twice born, but it's also dealing with the idea of ancient cultures reborn as modern nations. And so that's like the kind of fundamental tension of the book, is this idea of rebirth. Yeah. Yeah.
My name is Devashish. Aatish, hi.
Hi.
Yeah. Uh, whatever little I have read about you, you deal with complex place, complex language, Sanskrit, complex topic. Okay. So, Puri here is similar, complex. The way you've written about Banaras, okay, it's complex. Jagannath cult is again complex. Gita Govinda is complex. And so is the shipbuilding. Have you thought of, writing something from these, and also from the point of view of Tantra, which is, very much intrinsic to this place? Is that
Okay,
the thought which has come
that
across?
much. We'll have to keep it short, yes.
The short answer is no. One of the reasons I wrote about Benares is because, as Diana X says, it's a place where all of India is gathered. And for me, because I was working with a prism, which is to say a kind of metaphor, the people that I was using were entirely Brahmin, but they were Brahmins from Bengal, from the north, from Madhya Pradesh, from Bihar. And so the idea was to deal with these different lenses, because obviously one knows that the cultural makeup of India is diverse, but I wanted, for the reduction in scale, I wanted to use Benares and not to go too wide, because the thing that I was looking at is so wide that unless it was reduced in scale like this, it would get lost.
Okay, one last question.
All right, Aatish, my name is Upali Aparajita. I teach communication and choreography at Carnegie Mellon. And
Just a little bit louder, please.
my name is Upali Aparajita, and I teach communication and choreography at Carnegie Mellon University. Your aunt Betty's been a friend of mine for 40 years.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, delighted that you are pursuing the deep study of Sanskrit. Let me quote one stanza from Kumar Sambhavam from you, which you will
Ma'am, we are really out of time. Could
All
you?
right, so
He has a flight to catch at
all right,
8.
have a flight.
I'll come to the question then, and I'll quote afterwards for you. You alluded to Panini and the Ashtadhyayi. For the benefit of this audience, do you want to allude to a little bit to Geek Sublime and how it, generates computer language?
No, you have to ask Vikram Chandra.
Okay, so then I'll ask the last question. One character who fascinated me right through the book, and then it ends. I feel the conclusion of the book for me was when you say the way Alice Boner left Europe and came here.
Yeah.
So you had to leave India, and though you loved it deeply, and you've decided to set up home elsewhere. So just briefly about this wonderful character in the book who embraces Benares and makes it her home till she dies there.
Yeah, she is an absolutely wonderful character. She's born. You would have seen that film, ABB, Bovary. It's a big European firm at the time. So, yeah, right. And so she was born to this industrialist family, and she was Swiss, developed an interest in art, and kind of arrives in Paris in the 20s, finds it kitschy. And sort of, she just says, the pert, lewd atmosphere of Paris disgusted me. And she meets Uday Shankar, who at the time is a kind of phenomena and is described as sort of Hindu thought, alive in the flesh. And his dance is like taking Europe by storm. And she becomes the lover of Uday Shankar, and he brings her to India. And their relationship falls apart, but her love of India doesn't fall apart, and she comes to Benares in about 1936 and lives there right till almost to 1980, and makes the study of Indian art, and especially of yantras, her kind of ruling passion. In fact, spent a lot of time in Orissa as well with a teacher, and has left behind this quite magical diary. And for me, it was, I actually didn't know anything about Alice when I arrived to stay in her house, and just began to read the diary during the Modi election. And I was so struck, because she became a kind of friend across time, because the resonance between her concerns was so similar to mine. And I was kind of amazed that this voice should be there sort of guiding me, and that she needed to. She keeps describing. She says India was the country where the soul felt best, and it's not. She's very homesick in many ways, but she feels that to realize her dharma, she must come to India, and I felt a kind of symmetrical relationship in some ways, because one of the things that this book acknowledges is the idea of distance, that the people who we become because of historical phenomena, we don't want to undo those people. We don't want to pretend that that break hasn't occurred. The question is what you do afterwards, what journey you make after you recognize that that break has occurred. And for me personally, it had taken me back to Europe and America, and so I felt like Alice Bona and I had kind of like passed, you know, in this house, both heading in the opposite direction.
Yes, I found that the most wonderful way that it's towards the end of the book when you said that, you know, your paths crossed each other. So thank you, Aatish. And you know, the title Twice Born, for me, you know, I guess the book belongs to the reader after the writers published it. I think every Indian has to be twice born. By accident of birth, we are born Indian, and then we have to decide what kind of Indians we want to be, and that decision makes each one of us twice born. So so we are all Dvija in that sense. So thank you for this very deep and wonderful book, and do buy it. Aatish is a flight to catch. He's kindly signed books and kept it at the bookstall. So please do pick it up. It's a tough read, but it is a very rewarding
don't
one.
Say tough read. It's written
no, I
very
think tough,
simply.
Tough is a good word. Tough
it's
read,
a very
but a
simple,
rewarding
very
one.
easy book.
It's a rewarding read. Let's agree on that.